Nice place, Dion commented as they paused in the front of the gates. The neighborhood they were going to was behind a tall, sturdy looking wall. They had to wait for the man they were visiting to buzz them in. When the gates finally opened, Lu Zin drove into the compound. All the houses were large and handsome. They all had beautiful lawns and lovely gardens. Expensive cars were parked in the driveways. This was a lot nicer than the other parts of Urenco Dion had visited so far. Still, Dion didn't get his hopes up. "We're wasting our time," he told Richard as they got out of the car. Lu Zin led the way up to the house and knocked on the door. A middle-aged man answered. He smiled and stood back and let them enter. "Maybe," Richard agreed quietly, "but we've got to check, right? You never know." Dion was grateful to have his friend with him. Normally, Lucigi was one to reassure him whenever he started to get down. She was still on the other side of the world, but it was almost as if she had sent Richard to fill in for her. Besides, Richard was right. It was possible, and they had to check out every lead. Otherwise, they could wind up missing the real Gobi when she did turn up, and that would be their own fault. So Dion followed Lu Zin inside. They headed down a nice, wide hallway into a big, fancy living room. It was packed with people, and after a second or two, Dion realized that he knew most of them. It looked like the entire team was there. Dion glanced around. Lots of people, but no sign of a dog. Was this even the right place? But everyone else was smiling and looked really happy. They wouldn't be that excited if there wasn't a dog around. "What's everyone doing here?" he asked a search team volunteer as he reached her. Richard translated for them. She laughed. "We all wanted to be here when you and Gobi were reunited," she explained. She waved a hand at the rest of the search team. No one wanted to miss this. "How are you all so sure it's her, though?" Dion continued. "None of you ever met her." He didn't point out that they had thought they'd found Gobi several times before. The search team hadn't all turned up for each of those dead ends. But the woman just smiled. "There's something about this one," she told him. "You'll see. We think this is really her." Dion sighed. "I hope you're right," he replied. "I really do." He didn't want to remind her that they had been sure each of the other times too. It wasn't their fault. The search team members wanted this to happen almost as much as he did. But while there were thousands of stray dogs out there, there was only one Gobi, and he wasn't about to settle for anything less. He made his way slowly through the crowd. Even though he was taller than anyone else here, he still couldn't see much. Then a group of people stepped away from a long, low couch, and there, sitting beside it, was a bundle of sandy brown fur. Dion stopped and stared. "Gobi?" he whispered. At the sound of his voice, the dog's head shot up. Dark eyes latched onto him. Then the dog shot across the room and jumped at his knees, tail wagging ferociously. "It's her!" Dion shouted, scooping Gobi into his arms. She started yapping at him, just as she had every time he'd reached the finish line, and she was waiting for him. "This is Gobi," he announced to the room, spinning around. "It's her!" Gobi couldn't believe her luck. Ever since the man had left, life had gone downhill. There had been noise and pain and hunger and fear, and it had left her head spinning. She had always hoped that the man would come back. She had never even been sure why he had left. Everything had been a blur for so long. Then she had been here in this house with all these people, and then suddenly she had heard his voice. At first she thought she was dreaming, but then she had seen him standing there. He wasn't wearing the same clothes or the same shoes, but she was sure it was him. And when he picked her up, she knew she was right. He was back. He had found her again. Everything else in the world seemed to disappear for Dion. All he could see was Gobi. He kept wondering if he was dreaming, but then she would bark or lick his face, and he knew he was awake. This was real. He had found her. Just to be sure, though, he stepped away from her to the other side of the room. Then he clicked his tongue the way he always had when he called her. She was at his side in an instant, and when he started to walk away, she marched his when he stepped away, she matched his stride perfectly. There was no question about it. It was really her. She had changed, though, and not for the better. Dion headed back over to the couch and lifted Gobi up into his lap so he could study her more carefully. The scar from the picture was even more pronounced in person. It was as wide as his fingers and ran from the right eye to the back of her left ear. It was red and raw, so either it had happened recently or it hadn't healed properly yet. Either way, she was lucky to be alive. Whatever had caused that scar could have killed her. Dion wondered if she had been hurt anywhere else. He ran his hands gently over the wriggling body, and she winced when he brushed her right hip. Yes, he thought, she'd been limping a little as they just walked. Now she is still using all four legs, but now he could see that she wasn't putting much weight on that paw. Had that happened at the same time as the scar, or was it from a completely separate incident? Where had she been all this time? What had she go through just to get here? He wished he could ask Gobi herself what had happened. He was sure she would tell him if she could. But no matter how strong their bond was, she was still a dog. The closest she could get to telling him anything was the bark and a yip and an occasional whimper. And to stare him in the eye, as she always had, that stare told Dion the most important thing, that Gobi was as happy to see him as he was to see her. "We're back together, Gobi," he whispered to her, watching her ears perk up as she listened, "and I promise to keep you safe now."